starting now. And I'm letting everybody in. Welcome to the NCGE webinar series for the 22-23 school year. We're really excited about tonight's webinar. My name is Julie Wakefield, and I'm the Professional Development Coordinator and Resource Specialist for NCGE. The National Council for Geographic Education believes that geography education is a bridge to better understanding and appreciation of all subject matters. NCGE is a nonprofit organization that is committed to ensuring that all students graduate with the knowledge, perspectives, and skills to make informed decisions as they go through life. They support all educators in their desire to create engaging, authentic, inquiry-based learning experiences for all students at all levels. Today, we also have Mona Atria with us from George Washington University. She's an associate professor of geography and director of the Institute of Middle East Studies. And Mona is going to introduce our co-sponsor for the webinar.
Okay, thanks so much, Julie. We're really excited to kick off the first of a series of webinars that we'll be doing in collaboration with NCGE, which is the program is on the theme of knowing the world. And it's about Middle East and North Africa geographic education. So it's funded through the Title VI Department of Education grant for a National Resource Center in Middle East Studies. And we're going to be offering a course of workshops on themes like climate change, urbanization, reimagining North Africa and the relationship with sub-Saharan Africa. And actually in January, we'll be doing a mapping cartography workshop. So we're just really excited to launch this partnership. And I want to thank Julie for all her hard work in making this possible.
Thank you, Mona. It's been great creating this partnership between the two groups. So I look forward to more of this. Tonight's webinar, Water Politics and Environmental Justice. Water quenches thirst, it sustains crops, generates power, cools industry, conveys ships, carries waste, and maintains ecosystems. This webinar examines the political, social, and cultural dimensions of each of these factors of water resource management. We'll explore the political dynamics of water distribution, access, and use. We'll also investigate questions of urban water management, river restoration, water-related hazards, shared transboundary waters, and the threat of water wars. This being someone from the Southwest, this is going to make some great parallels for my teaching. Anyway, joining us tonight is Dr. Jessica Barnes, an associate professor in the Department of Geography in the School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment at the University of South Carolina. She's the author of Cultivating the Nile, The Everyday Politics of Water in Egypt, also published by Duke University Press, and the co-editor of Climate Cultures, Anthropological Perspectives on Climate Change. Welcome to Dr. Jessica Barnes. Thank you for being here. Tonight's webinar, as we know, is also supported by the State Department grant that Mona talked about. So thank you all for being here. Please feel free to utilize the chat with questions and conversation throughout, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So with that, again, thank you for joining us. And Dr. Barnes, it is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Judy. It's just a pleasure to be here with you all. Geography was my favorite subject as a student. You can probably hear I'm English, so it's a big subject in England, and I love geography as a high school student. My first degree is in geography, and now I'm an associate professor of geography. So it's great to be here with all these fellow people who are interested in geography. What I thought I'd talk to you today is about sort of water politics with a particular focus on the Middle East. So I'm going to focus on this area, but there are many parallels with issues in the US West. So I'd be happy to reflect on those or answer any questions on those in the Q&A at the end. So when we think about the Middle East, this is what we commonly see, these stories of crisis, of scarcity, possibly even a war over water. And this is actually an activity I often like to do with my students, which is I put these kinds of headlines up on the board and have them analyze what are these narratives, what are these stories that these headlines combined are telling us. And I think when you combine this kind of narrative along with these very kind of potent images of sort of parched riverbeds, denuded reservoirs, the absurdity of a camel, the epitome of the Middle East stereotype, being fed bottled water to drink. It creates this very sort of powerful impression and association in students' minds, in the kind of general public's minds, about the Middle East as being this region of water scarcity. And there are some elements of truth in this. The Middle East and North Africa is an arid region. So in Fayoum, Egypt, just to give you one example, this is where I conducted my own research. I conducted field work in this rural area since 2007. In this area, it rains less than 0.3 of an inch a year. So it almost basically doesn't really rain. So there are some places that are very arid. There are also some places where many people lack access to water for their basic needs. If you take a country like Yemen, for example, where an estimated 18 million people lack access to safe drinking water and sanitation at present. So there are certainly issues of water scarcity in the region, but the main point I want to make to you today is that this narrative of scarcity and crisis is an oversimplification. And I think one of the most valuable things we might do in our classes about water, whether we're talking about the Middle East or actually even if we're talking about the US West, is to help students understand that these simple narratives really obscuring the truth of what's going on there, obscuring some of the deeper political and economic and social questions. So the first point I wanted to underscore here, and which might be interesting if any of you have a kind of regional module in any of your courses and are talking about the Middle East, is that the Middle East, sort of contrary to some of these stereotypes we might have about the region, is actually quite diverse. So if we go back to that example from Fayoum, you can see this is an area that has almost no rainfall, but you can see it's also quite green, or in the case of this image, this lush field nearing harvest with the crop of wheat. It's very kind of intensely cultivated. The soils are very rich. They have a very abundant agricultural production. And the reason why is because this area receives water from the Nile, the longest river in the world, that flows northwards, from the East African highlands to the Mediterranean. So the situation in Fayoum is quite different here from that of other sort of similarly arid parts of the region, which don't have that source of irrigation water. So just as an example, there we see an image of the Nile. We can see the map of the Nile. I'll come back to that actually, because I think it's quite an interesting case study that we can kind of use to look at some of these key issues. But if this image here is actually taken just about 30 miles from where that previous picture of the wheat field is taken. And this is just a little bit further to the west. And the difference here is that this image is taken outside the borders of the Nile Valley, outside of the borders of the Fayoum Depression, which is just a little offshoot from the Nile Valley, where there's no irrigation water. And as a result, you have this very arid landscape. So while there are some places that match our kind of desert stereotypes, there are others where water is actually relatively plentiful, either because they have irrigation water from the Nile or from groundwater, or because they do receive some rainfall. This picture, for example, is taken from Syria, from the mountains of Syria. I remember actually the year I studied Arabic for a year in Damascus, and I remember how surprised I was when it snowed in Damascus. It wasn't the kind of image I had of the Middle East, but indeed there are some parts of the Middle East that are relatively wet, that receive a considerable precipitation, and in the winter where it snows. So students might be surprised to find out that you can actually go skiing in Lebanon. And I love to show my students some clips from the Lebanese tourist agency of the mountains of Lebanon that are advertising skiing there, because it always sort of blows their mind. It's not what they think of when they think of the Middle East at all. So you have these considerable differences kind of across space, these spatial differences in water resources access. And then when we're thinking about these spatial differences, one of the very interesting things about the Middle East is actually the fact that many of the water resources that there are, both surface and subsurface, cross national borders. So one of the ways we can get at this is by looking at this, this metric, the dependency ratio, which is the proportion of a nation's water supply that comes from outside its borders. So these are pretty kind of mind-blowing statistics if you really think about it. For a country like Egypt, 98% of its water comes from outside of its territory, and that would be through the Nile. So another kind of fun exercise that you could do potentially with your students is to give them this data, perhaps with an atlas, and have them try and work out what these figures are reflecting. So with Egypt, that's a question. It's showing that Egypt is so reliant on the Nile, which comes from outside of Egypt. Iraq, that's showing the Tigris and Euphrates. So Iraq is downstream of both. So the Tigris and Euphrates both start in Turkey, flow through Syria, and then come to Iraq. So that's what we're seeing there. Jordan, we're seeing the water that comes from the River Jordan, which is largely controlled by Israel. These other, the Bahrain, that's reflecting the fact that they are reliant on groundwater that actually sort of rises from underneath the Saudi Arabia territory, and the same with Kuwait. So these are kind of quite fun statistics to think about, and I think, you know, especially teaching an American audience, it might be interesting to have them reflect on, you know, how do you think you would feel if, you know, so much of the water that that everyone relies on for their you know, their daily needs that you are reliant on another country for that water. Because I think it's something that we living in you know, a country like the United States or a country like the United Kingdom, where I came from, it's difficult to really sort of fathom how that would feel. And if you're living in the US West, that could segue into a very interesting discussion of the Colorado River and transboundary rivers to Mexico as well. So what this is sort of illustrating as well also is that although the Middle East is a pretty arid area, large parts of it are very arid, many countries have a source of water that arises in a much less arid area. So in the case of Egypt, that's sort of rising around Lake Victoria and then in the Ethiopian highlands. As well as these spatial differences, you also have considerable temporal differences. And I'm glad to hear from Dr. Attia that you're going to be having they're offering a whole other seminar on climate change, because there's a lot of detail and interesting things you could talk about that. But if we were just giving a couple of kind of broad key trends that the climate models are saying for the Middle East and North Africa region, they consistently show a warming trend, so an increase in average temperatures of particular concern to a number of countries in the region, or an increase in the number of above 40 degrees centigrade days. And that obviously will affect water resources because it will affect evapotranspiration rates. It will affect agriculture. It will also affect kind of water losses from open patches of water like reservoirs. In terms of precipitation, there's actually a lot of uncertainty. So a lot of, as you probably many of you are aware, modeling precipitation under different climate change scenarios, it just carries a lot more uncertainty. There's a lot more things that climate scientists still don't totally understand about how these dynamics will all intersect with one another. But so broadly speaking, it seems that there are certainly some areas, some of the areas that presently receive a bit more rainfall, like in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, for example, in the Lebanese mountains, which are likely to see a decline in precipitation. Probably we're going to see more variability in precipitation. And interestingly, though, it's not a completely consistent pattern across the region, and there may be a few areas where actually the rainfall increases. But this kind of underscores that there are certainly temporal dynamics at work, temporal differences at work here. So my second kind of point I wanted to underscore is that really to understand this question of water scarcity, though, I think the key question in my mind is that we have to really interrogate this question of what the water is being used for. So one of the common metrics that's used to as an indicator of scarcity to address whether or not, to classify countries in terms of the degree of scarcity is this indicator called the Falkenmark Water Stress Index. And it's actually quite old. It was developed back in 1989, but it's still very commonly used. And I think one of the reasons probably why it's so commonly used is it's very simple. So indeed also would be something easily calculable by a high school student. You can find data on the total freshwater availability from the FAO StatNet database. That's the database organized by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. It has some great data available on it. And population data is very easy to find. And this Falkenmark Water Stress Index is just found by dividing water availability by population. So it's a very simple metric. And what Malin Falkenmark and her colleagues did back in 1989 was that they then looked at different kinds of water needs around the world. So they were looking at the amount of water that's needed for people to drink, but also the amount of water that's needed to grow food, for industrial use, for other kinds of uses within the home. And they came up with these different thresholds at which they calculated that water, you could say that there was scarcity. So they said if you have over 1,000, if you have over 1,700 cubic meters of water per capita available, then you're in a no stress situation. But below 1,000, you're really in the situation of scarcity. If you have less than 500 cubic meters of water per capita available, then you're in the situation of absolute scarcity. And so there are endless maps like this available online. And what you can see when you look at this kind of data, it's a little bit out of date, 2007, but you get the impression here. You can see that there are these parts of the world where the situation is looking very dire, the Middle East and North Africa being one of them. And you can also look at this data. This is from the World Bank. You can look at this data on a regional basis. And once again, we can see how the Middle East and North Africa is looking considerably worse off than any other part of the world. So these are the kinds of metrics that are used that underscore these narratives of scarcity and these concerns about water scarcity. But I think it's important that we kind of interrogate really what these statistics are saying and what it really means. Because I think often when I talk with my students about this question, then their assumption is that if you're in this situation of scarcity, so where there's a country is in a situation where you have less than 1,000 cubic meters of water available per person per year, then they assume that people are facing scarcity in their daily lives. What they are then surprised to know is that actually the amount of water that people need in their daily lives, as in to drink, to wash, to cook, to clean their house, to maintain their sanitation, is very low. It's less than 20 cubic meters per person per year. And this always really surprises my students. But what it is a reflection of is the fact that people actually need much less water than plants do. So the amount of water that it's estimated, although of course this is just a very rough estimate, is that for domestic purposes, people need around 50 liters of water a day, but the amount of water that's needed to grow the food someone will eat in a day is around 3,500. So to understand water scarcity, what we really have to do is think about what that water is being used for and who is using it. And in the case of the Middle East, what this means is really thinking about and looking at agriculture, which uses about 85% of the world's water. Now you can see this is actually a global pattern. So if we look globally, 70% of the fresh water in the world is used in irrigation, is used in agriculture. So, and if we look in the US West, Southwest, also we see a very large chunk of that water is being used in irrigation. But it is particularly pronounced in the Middle East and North Africa. So what this does is that then raises sort of a whole different host of questions about, well, why are governments choosing to use so much of their limited water supply in agricultural production. And here it comes down to kind of a lot of interesting questions of politics. In the case of the Middle East region, agriculture is no longer kind of a central cornerstone of most countries' economies. It's a relatively small contribution to GDP, for example, but it plays an outsized role in a country like Egypt in employment. So still a significant chunk of the Egyptian population, I'm afraid I can't think of the statistic off my top of my head. Those statistics are also available online through the World Bank, but I think it's roughly 50% of the population is involved in agriculture or in related industries. So there are other reasons why countries might choose to devote quite a large chunk of this precious resource to agricultural production, even though it uses up so much water. There are also important issues around food security that if anyone's interested in, I would happily talk about afterwards. I've actually just finished a book and I can share a resource. I just finished a book all about bread and wheat in Egypt and how there is like this intense concerns about the wheat and bread supply that we've really seen in light of the conflict in Ukraine also. And so, these countries are also wanting to grow food because they want to make sure that they can produce some of these kind of core crops like wheat for their countries to eat. So I'm happy to come back to sort of any of these questions or any of these issues if anyone would like to talk about them more in the Q&A. But I thought for kind of the second bit of my brief talk, perhaps I would just give a bit of a case study of the Nile River, because I think it's such an interesting example. I'm obviously biased because I study it, but I think it's an interesting example that could resonate with students. So the Nile is 6,700 kilometers long, although obviously how do you measure the length of a river? It's a tricky question. It has these true tributaries. You have the Blue Nile that comes from the East African highlands, from Ethiopia, and the White Nile. The Blue Nile is the major tributary, so about 85% of the water comes through the Blue Nile. And so you have this transboundary water basin that's shared by 11 countries. And then you have also that so it's shared by all these countries, and then it's crossing this very distinct rainfall gradient. So I'm sorry that this is not such a great satellite image, but what I think it really clearly shows just with the colors is you can see the kind of distinction between these highland areas in the red boxes, the kind of source regions of the river, where rainfall is sort of over 1,100 millimeters a year, and then the northern part of the country, the river from about Khartoum northwards, that basically flows through a desert where there's almost no rainfall. So you have this distinct rainfall gradient, and what this does is it sets up a sort of mismatch in space between where the water is coming from and where it is most dependent upon. Because in the absence of rainfall, this really is the only source of water to speak of in Egypt. So as we saw those statistics earlier, about 95%, about 98% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile. On top of this mismatch in space, this distinction in the rainfall gradient, you also have the fact that this management of the river, use of the river, is governed by an agreement that dates back to 1959. So the agreement for the full utilization of the Nile waters was signed in the 1950s between Egypt and Sudan. So if we put ourselves back in the kind of the mindset of what was going on in the 1950s, Sudan had just gained independence and wanted a larger share of Nile water than that which it had been granted by an earlier agreement which Britain signed on behalf of Sudan when it was a British colony. And Egypt too wanted to secure its water supply because it was just about to build this huge dam across the Nile, the Aswan High Dam. So in 1959, they came to this agreement where they agreed to increase basically both countries' water allocations compared to the previous agreement. But as you can see, these are figures of 1 billion cubic meters. As you can see, Egypt still has by far the dominant share of this water. Sudan only has 18.5 to Egypt's 55.5. And the reason for this unequal allocation was the division was made based on Egypt's historic rights. So the argument that was placed was that because Egypt has this long history of cultivation dating back to ancient Egypt, they were entitled to continue using that amount of water, and so that sort of secured their right to ongoing use of that volume of water. And as you'll sort of notice, the upstream countries weren't party to this agreement, so they were just ignored in this process. Now, since then, over the last few decades, the other countries of the Nile Basin have been coming together and saying, this isn't fair. Why should we're completely left out of this agreement, but it's our river too. And they've been pushing, and this has been a long negotiation that's been mediated by various international organizations. And they did, after a long negotiation process, they came up with this new agreement for the Nile, which is called the Cooperative Framework Agreement, which is based on the principle of equitable utilization rather than historic rights. So it's saying, okay, even though Egypt has used this water historically, let's think now about how we could divide this water up equitably. But it hasn't yet been fully ratified because, as you can probably imagine, some of the downstream countries like Egypt and Sudan aren't really willing to give up that historic right. They aren't really willing to give up their dominancy in the river basin. So the current situation is that 6 of the upstream countries have signed this agreement, but it hasn't yet been fully ratified because they haven't been able to get enough countries to kind of buy in on it yet. So this is the sort of geographical and legal setting for the Nile and for a kind of long-standing kind of conflict over division of its waters. And this is also the context in which Ethiopia decided to build this huge dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam, or sometimes known as the Hidasi Dam. And in fact, in 2022, you could easily find some recent news articles about this. They just started working there. It's a hydropower dam, and they just started working their first electricity production through the dam, running their first turbine. So the big reservoir behind the dam is only about a third full, but they are already starting to generate electricity. And this actually could be a very interesting case study, perhaps for a debate between students, because it raises some very interesting kind of, you can really clearly see the 2 different perspectives on it. So from the Ethiopian perspective, they're wanting to develop this resource, the river that's flowing from their country, to develop electricity production. There's still a large chunk of a pretty significant chunk of the Ethiopian population still doesn't have electricity. And so this would be a major boost to the national electricity supply and could help alleviate that need. Moreover, the capacity is such that Ethiopia is hoping it will be able to generate so much electricity, it will be able to start exporting electricity to other countries in some neighboring countries. And actually, there are even some pretty ambitious plans for larger scale distribution of energy stemming from this dam. So from Ethiopia's perspective, this is a resource that it should have a right to, that comes from its country, that could bring this valuable thing to its population, electricity, and could also bring valuable resources to the country. But from the Egyptian perspective, and from Sudan as well, this is very, very politically contentious. Egypt is just really has been terrified about, to be honest, what the implications of this dam could be. The fact that the notion of an upstream country having such control over the river. And just as a side note, you'll see on this map that there are a number of other dams along the Nile. The Nile is a very controlled flow. It's very clearly kind of closely mediated at a number of spots. But the difference with the Hidasi is just the scale of it. So it's a scale is such that it could actually potentially hold back a very major portion of the flow of the river in this large reservoir. So it's been very controversial. And there are 2 kind of key controversy here, 2 key kind of issues. The first regards the filling of the reservoir. So as I said, they've started this process, but they're still only a third of the way there. But there is a precedent for some concern about this. So just to give another example, back in 1989, Turkey completed its Ataturk Dam on the on the Euphrates. So it completed this big dam, and then Turkey wanted to fill its reservoir behind the dam so they could start operating the dam. And so to do this, they completely closed off the dam and shut off the flow of the Euphrates. As a result, Syria and Iraq, the downstream countries that are highly reliant on this water, faced huge water shortages. This came to kind of a peak when Iraq said, this is just not tenable. This is a terrible situation, and they threatened to bomb the dam if Turkey didn't release water through it. And the situation was only appeased when Turkey agreed indeed to do just that. It opened up the dam to alleviate the water shortages downstream. So this was a particular concern with the Hidasi, the Grand Renaissance Dam, of would Ethiopia try and do something like this? Would it just kind of close off the Nile so it could fill its reservoir as quickly as possible? So there was a lot of discussion in the news about this, the reservoir filling time, which is just literally the time they decide, the period over which they can fill the reservoir. It would never happen in just a year, but the question was, would they do it over a 6 to 7 year period, or over a 20-year period, over a 1 or 2 year period? Now, so far, that's it. Here you can just see a map that illustrates where the Ataturk Dam is and the implications for Syria and Iraq if the river's kind of completely cut off at that point. So far, I would say that the concerns about the filling of the reservoir the fears haven't been manifest. The fears haven't been fulfilled, in that Ethiopia has been filling its dam, but it hasn't completely shut off the flow of the river. It's actually been a pretty good rainfall year, and I haven't read a lot of reports about Egyptian farmers facing scarcity. So it seems that Ethiopia is not going to go down the route of trying to do something very radical and filling the dam quickly, which I think isn't really surprising. It would be a very dangerous thing to do. In the longer term, the key question is, how will they operate the dam? Because one of the things that people sometimes don't kind of fully appreciate with a dam along a river is that if you're running a dam just for hydropower, then you're storing the water and then you're releasing it through the dam to run those turbines and generate electricity. But then the water continues on down the river. I mean, you'll have some evaporation losses from the reservoir, but basically the water is continuing on down the river. So if they continue just to use this dam for hydropower generation, it won't necessarily reduce the amount of water that Egypt and Sudan receive. However, should they decide to develop irrigated agriculture around the dam or just over the border in Sudan, that would have a very different ramification, because obviously when you're irrigating agriculture with water, that water is all lost through evapotranspiration. It doesn't continue on down the river. So there are a lot of questions remaining about what this water will be used for. Also, what will happen in a drought year? What will happen when the river flows? You have a dry year. How are they going to kind of divide up the water then? There are a lot of remaining questions, but it's certainly kind of a very interesting case study. So this particular case of the Nile is often talked about in terms of this notion of a water war, which I think partly it's drawn on a lot because it has this sort of fascinating ring to it. It kind of grabs the attention. In my personal opinion, I think the likelihood of a water war is pretty low if we're defining war as an armed conflict. I mean, I think sometimes people use war in a slightly more kind of general term without that specific meaning. One of the things that a lot of research has shown over the years is that also, that water isn't shared water. It doesn't have to be a source of conflict. It can also be a source of cooperation. And also, I think one of the things I found in my research, and that I talked a lot about in my first book, is that the notion of this water war, one of the problems is it reduces the conflict to just a question of the relationship between states. So it becomes just an issue of kind of Ethiopia versus Sudan versus Egypt. But what I saw in my own research is that sometimes the most sort of contentious dynamics, the most contentious kind of political conflict around water happens around the sites of day-to-day use within states. So where farmers are kind of diverting water onto their fields, or an engineer is opening and closing a small dam. So what this points to, I think, is that sort of core geographical tenet of the need to think about multiple scales. So we can't just reduce this to think about things on an interstate level, but we have to think about sort of multiple scales of action, multiple scales of relationships and politics. So if I just sort of summarize my final sort of key point is that really this question of water in the Middle East isn't just a question of limited water supplies and growing populations, just as that isn't the case in California either. Although actually it'd be very interesting to compare the kinds of narratives, how often the California water crisis is talked about in terms of population. I suspect perhaps not quite so much as it is in the Middle East context. In the Middle East, there's a real tendency to kind of blame it on people for having too many babies. So obviously, population is high and is growing rapidly in the Middle East region. Water resources are limited, if you think back to some of those earlier slides and those statistics of precipitation. But is the problem simply one of limited water and too many people? It's not. It's really the issue, in my opinion, is so much more about how the water is being used, and the fact that this high water use in agriculture. And if we want to really understand that, we have to enter into these kind of complex and messy world of political relations and uneven power dynamics. So I think I'll leave it there. I think that was around the time that Julie asked me to speak to, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions or elaborate on anything that I see some questions to in the
Yeah, so we have some people with some diverse questions in different parts of the United States, asking about Lake Powell. Also in the West, as I mentioned when we were talking earlier, and then Nicole's question there in the end was specifically, I believe, about the dam and how they were filling the dam up, and I'm not sure if that got answered. So we'll start with Thomas since he popped on, and go ahead and ask your question, Thomas.
Hey, thank you very much, Dr. Barnes. This was a fantastic presentation, and I saw a lot of kind of spatial analogies between the Nile River and what I often teach, because I spent a good amount of time in Kansas with the Arkansas River and the relationship between Colorado and Kansas. And I have a question for you, because you brought up a really good point about talking with students about in trying to prime them to do more holistic research on the Middle East, and recognizing that it is far more complex than they could have ever imagined. And one of the issues that I run in with my students is whenever they research a paper, they have a tendency to go with the first couple, things that pop up on Google. And chances are they're coming from think tanks, which have their own political agenda. And so I didn't know with your students, how you might prime them to at least let them know that, okay, if you're going to use these types of resources, you should probably look at them with a more critical eye to see, okay, what might be some of the motives for how they interpret these particular issues.
Yeah, that's such a great point, actually, the fact that kind of the Google factor of what was going to come up first when you look at something. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's absolutely true. I mean, I suppose one way of doing that could be, having an assignment where they have to find sort of something, the most surprising thing they find out about them, or something that like they didn't know, that could lead them to something else. Or I suppose, an activity I often do with my classes is I show a headline or I show an image, and we talk about, what is the story this is trying to tell? Like what impression is this trying to tell? And then I ask them, what is erased from this? What is, what are we not seeing either outside the image, or what questions is this not asking, to try and really get them. So hoping that they'll then apply similar tactics when they are looking at those resources. But it is a tricky one. And I can't think just off the top of my head of like a great source that you could go to direct them to where they would get kind of the radical different perspective. But maybe just teaching them to kind of approach those sources with a slightly more critical angle could be, or, you know, or I suppose you could ask them, did you notice anything about like like what were all the when you Googled, like what were the stories telling you, like to try and get them to realize that, to ask that question themselves or to notice that themselves.
Yeah, I like that a lot, because there seems to be kind of a discrepancy between what gets taught during lecture, because I'm a university instructor, and then what students will end up writing. And so hopefully trying to bring us to deeper thinking about these particular issues. And sometimes students will go into their preconceived notions about the Middle East when describing that. So thank you for the recommendations.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to actually, as Nicole asked that question about the evaporation with the Nile, it's an interesting example, because actually the evaporative losses will be, if you're thinking about the Nile Basin as a whole, Ethiopia is quite a good place to store water because the evaporation losses are lower, because it's not nearly as sunny and hot as it is in Egypt. So back in there's like a longer kind of colonial history of where you had British irrigation engineers in Egypt in the late 19th century saying, well, we should actually build our reservoir up in Ethiopia, because then we won't lose so much water to evaporation. But you know, it's not just, but that's it's so contentious for Egypt to think about someone else controlling the water supply. So that's a kind of good example of how perhaps different scales of thinking and how different people think on different scales. So if we were a water manager, we might say, well, let's think of the river basin as a whole. Where should we store this water? But politicians don't think like that. You know, they want to have control over it.
Yeah, Nicole just asked another great question. I don't know if you can see it. She lived in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, where swimming pools and golf courses are the key to tourists. Is there any kind of movement that you're aware of in the Gulf states to reduce this type of, I called it aesthetic water, because I was kind of surprised when I was there too. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, there's I think that's really interesting too, and that's another thing I sometimes do is show some like tourism, either tourism brochures or brochures from housing developments in the UAE to show how they're using this real sort of green. There's a lot of vegetation that's not arid. It's not arid friendly vegetation. It's a lot of lawns, lush plants, and yeah, it's sort of crazy, I think. There's a very interesting book called Paradoxes of Green in the UAE, and it's all about kind of this, it's written by a design scholar, but it's all about the kind of yearning or the attraction to kind of green landscapes. And it sort of has a symbolism in Islam as well, and in that region. Another interesting case study or example actually you might look at is the plans for the new capital city in Egypt. So as some people might know, the Egyptian government's developing this this mega project out in the desert, sort of east of Cairo, that has as its centerpiece a green river that is 30 times the size of Central Park, or going to be 30 times, like a very large park. That's all going to rely on irrigation water from the Nile. So it's a sort of interesting contrast to, you know, all the government's concerns about water scarcity, and yet they are developing this crazy mega project that's going to have this huge irrigated park in it, which is really just a sort of fancy project.
I'm just putting ideas in the chat for lesson plans that we can start thinking about and putting together as you're talking. Other questions, anybody? Other ideas? I also, in my world regional class, compare the Mekong River with development and all of the dams that China is building upstream that's impacting the countries in Southeast Asia. So this would be a good way to tie in that region of the world to do, because it's at the end of the school year. So I try to do some real global activities. So yeah, those couple dams, I was aware of the Ethiopian dam, but I was not aware of the Ataturk dam.
Yeah. I was just seeing there was a question above from someone about Utah, the parallels about MENA and the American West. I mean, I think there's just so many interesting parallels actually around the dominance of use in agriculture. I mean, I suppose one difference is that the agricultural lobby seems to me, I was thinking there are different kind of power relations in the American West. But there are many interesting parallels. And actually, as I said, I don't think so often the narrative about water in the West is talked about in terms of population, in very simple terms of population. I think there's perhaps a bit more acknowledgement or understanding that it's agriculture that's driving this, whereas in the Middle East, it really is so often reduced to population. And obviously there is a link between population and agriculture, but it's not a direct link. More people don't necessarily grow more food or use more water in agriculture. How much would they need?
Yeah, Julie, can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
Yeah, so Jessica, you said I think maybe in academia, I think a lot of people think about Western water in terms of agriculture, but being a relatively new resident in Utah, I moved from South Carolina out here 3 years ago. It's sort of interesting that I feel like the general public only thinks about it in terms of like population, like municipal water, and that there's not actually a lot of public perception on, I mean, alfalfa gets talked about some, but I think there's an interesting parallel between like what you're suggesting, like this hyper awareness in Egypt of like, where does my water come from and like, how are we using it? Whereas there's my sense in Utah that people are like, oh, we're just building too many homes, and if we could just stop the growth, our water would be fine, rather than considering like relationship to that, food nexus with water, and like, oh, Utah beef and Utah dairy, and these are all sort of good things in theory.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and certainly, there has been a lot of work. If I think I'm more familiar with the California case than Utah, but a lot of kind of efforts in places like LA to reduce domestic water use, which have a role to play in California. They have a role to play, but it's just it is still a relatively small proportion of the water use. So everyone having I don't know if you've ever used the water footprint tool, but that's quite a fun online tool. Students where they can calculate their water footprint. But I often find that students go from that to thinking that there's like this imperative for them to reduce their individual water footprint, a bit like a carbon footprint, but it really doesn't work. It sort of doesn't work quite like that. If you live with someone like South Carolina, you don't necessarily have an imperative. There's not really necessarily a need to reduce your water footprint. If you live in California, it's probably best for the agro industry to reduce their water footprint. Yeah.
Yeah, and like Philip, I'm in Nevada, so we see this conversation all the time about growth, and people don't realize the amount of agriculture that both of our states have. So, yeah. Any other questions? We're getting closer to an hour, and I want to respect everybody's time on this Monday. Dr. Barnes, thank you very much. Oh, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, just two really quick questions about the Nile River case that you presented. And you mentioned, right now, Ethiopia is maybe not planning a lot of irrigated agriculture, or that if they did, it would vastly impact downstream flows. Is there, I know Ethiopia somewhat is a dry-ish place, but how much of a need is there actually for irrigated agriculture versus, we could just expand non-irrigated?
Right, for rain-fed. That's a great question. The short answer is I'm not entirely sure. Certainly they have enough, but many places where there's enough rain for rain-fed agriculture, they use supplemental irrigation because to either kind of enable them to grow multiple crops a year or to enhance their yields. So I'm not sure exactly actually or if it's more sort of rumors that are going around. I'm also thinking about that part of the country and whether the terrain is such that it would be conducive for agriculture, because it's quite kind of it's not flat terrain, you know, there. So I think some of the rumors I'd heard or the Egyptians are worried about is actually about over the border in Sudan, that there could be more, which does have quite a lot of irrigation. It's getting a little drier as you go further north. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a precise answer to that, but that's obviously an important question to ask.
Yeah. So
I just shared the link for the primer. Do you want to let them know what information they can find in the primer? Yes,
that was a reader that summarized some of the points that I made today. So it gives a brief overview of water resource issues. It's written hopefully in a style that would be accessible to a high school audience. And it tries to kind of challenge some of these simple arguments and kind of outline some of these key themes in relation to the Middle East. And it has some nice graphics, has a couple of those bits of data that I showed you. So hopefully that will be of interest. And if anyone's interested, actually, I was just thinking about the question that Thomas asked about sort of how you get beyond the kind of what you see in the first thing of Google when you go to that. If anyone's interested, they can also feel free to email me, but because I'm an anthropologist geographer, you know, my books are full of stories about individual farmers. So it could be actually quite fun possibly to take, you know, obviously you wouldn't want to kind of assign a whole one of my chapters, but there are a number of like stories of individual farmers that could be quite fun to kind of to show to a student that would take them beyond those headlines and could be a nice reading. So if anyone's interested in something like that, you could feel free to email me and I can send you kind of a little extract from one of the chapters.
Yes, and that actually got me thinking about, I have a colleague of mine, Dr. Sham Sharam, and we're both interested in looking at sense of place among displaced folks, whether they be refugees, but thinking about the Grand Renaissance Dam, thinking about, you know, how dams lead to the displacement of peoples and seeing how the sense of place among those groups might change as they attempt the very difficult process of settling in a new place. And so I didn't know if there was any of that that you're working on or that other folks that might have maybe worked on.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, in the case of the Grand Renaissance Dam, my understanding is that it's definitely not a heavily settled area. I'm not aware that there's going to be anyone who's being resettled. Now, it might be that we have an erasure of a marginal kind of small villages. You know, there might be a little bit, but it's not a lot highly settled area at all. So I don't think that's a key issue, but thinking about the Nile, there were certainly issues with the creation of the Aswan High Dam back in the 1950s and the removal of the Nubian people. So that would be an interesting kind of example to look at, maybe.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, there are so many examples to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are some great resources in the chat. Thank you. I'm going to save that too, if I can work out how to do that, because you've got some great ideas there. Thank you.
Okay, well, this has definitely been fantastic. Thank you so much. And everybody, great conversation, great ideas and sharing of resources. Thank you for giving us some time on this Monday evening. The recording will be available to share with your colleagues if they were not able to come in the resource library of NCGE. So that will be up and shared in a very short period of time. So again, Dr. Barnes, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing what everybody comes up with water scarcity. So thank you guys. Have a great evening.
Thank you. It's really fun to talk with you all. Bye-bye.